April 1945, Dachau, Bavaria. American Lieutenant Colonel Jake Silverman watched 400 people die every day. Not from Nazi bullets, not from gas chambers or firing squads. They died after liberation. They died in the arms of their rescuers. They died because the medical care meant to save them was killing them faster than 12 years of Nazi torture ever could. Across the same camp, 19-year-old German Wehrmacht prisoner Hans Weber carried Jewish survivors on stretchers. His hands shook every time he touched them. The propaganda had told him these people were subhuman, dangerous, less than animals. But their bones felt like his grandfather's bones. Their eyes held the same fear he'd seen in his mother's face when the bombs fell on Munich. Within 8 days, these two enemies would prove that sometimes the most American thing you can do is break every rule to save lives, and 40 years later, they would meet again, this time as brothers. But first, they would have to survive hell. The smell hit the American soldiers first, a physical wall of death and decay that made grown men fall to their knees and vomit into the mud. It was April 29, 1945. The U.S. 42nd Infantry Division, the Rainbow Division, had just breached the gates of Dachau concentration camp. They expected to find prisoners. They found 32,000 walking skeletons and 2,000 corpses rotting in boxcars. Lieutenant Colonel Jacob Silverman stepped through those gates at 0800 hours, 28 years old, Brooklyn-born, Jewish, combat veteran who'd survived D-Day on Omaha Beach, the Battle of the Bulge, and the Rhine crossing. He thought he had seen the worst humanity could offer. He was wrong. The first prisoner he saw was a man, or what remained of a man, skin stretched over bones like tissue paper over a wire frame, eyes sunken so deep they looked like holes. The man reached toward Jake with a skeletal hand and whispered something in Yiddish. Jake spoke enough Yiddish from his grandmother. He understood the words. An American Jew in uniform. God has sent an angel. Jake looked at this man's face and saw his own grandmother, saw his rabbi, saw the faces of every family from his Brooklyn neighborhood. These people were his people, and they were dying by the hundreds even as American medics rushed to save them. The numbers told a story that made Jake's hands shake. First 24 hours after liberation, 150 deaths. Day 2, 300 deaths. Day 3, 400 deaths. The rate was accelerating, not declining. American doctors were following every protocol. Slow feeding for the starved, clean water, typhus treatment, antibiotics, warmth, care, and people kept dying. Jake spent 18 hours walking every inch of Dachau. He forced himself to look at everything. The medical tent where 200 patients crowded into space meant for 50. The single water pump where thousands waited in lines that never seemed to shrink. The barracks where 60 men shared rooms built for 12, breathing each other's infected air, spreading typhus faster than doctors could treat it. He saw the system, and he saw why it was failing. That night, Jake sat in his tent with a lamp and a notebook. His hands shook, not from cold, from rage. The military was trying to save individuals when they needed to save a population. Every protocol, every procedure, every rule in the medical handbook was designed for normal situations. This was not normal. This was 32,000 people dying because the rule book didn't have a chapter for hell. The idea came to him fully formed, so simple it seemed impossible, so dangerous he almost dismissed it himself. Move them, all of them. Get them out of this death trap and spread them across Bavaria where they could actually breathe clean air. Move the sickest first, the ones most likely to die. They stayed another day in these conditions. Move them fast. Move them now. Move them even if the moving itself was risky. He knew what the doctors would say. Moving critically ill patients was dangerous. The stress of transport could kill them. Better to keep them stable and treat them where they were. This was basic medical knowledge taught to every first-year nursing student. Jake looked at his notes. 400 deaths per day. That was the cost of keeping them stable. That was the price of following the rules. He made his decision. Tomorrow he would present his plan to the senior officers. They would probably laugh at him, maybe threaten him with discipline for wasting their time. He was just a combat officer with a crazy idea going up against trained medical experts who had forgotten more about medicine than he would ever know. But he had one advantage the experts did not have. He had nothing to lose. The doctors had their reputations, their protocols, their professional pride. Jake had only the faces of the dying and the unshakable belief that watching people die while following the rules was not medicine. It was just slow murder with paperwork. The lamp flickered. Outside, another night fell on Dachau. In the morning, 400 more would be dead unless someone did something impossible. Across the camp, Hans Weber lay in the prisoner barracks assigned to captured Wehrmacht soldiers. He could not sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the face of the Jewish woman he'd carried that afternoon. She weighed maybe 70 pounds, all bones and paper skin. She'd looked at him with such terror when the American guard ordered him to lift her onto the stretcher. Hans had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht at 17, a farm boy from Bavaria who knew more about dairy cows than combat. The training officers had taught him that Jews were the enemy, that they were responsible for Germany's defeat in the Great War, that they were subhuman parasites who deserved whatever happened to them. But this woman, this dying woman, she had whispered something in German as Hans set her gently on the stretcher. So young, just a boy. She'd touched his face with skeletal fingers. The kindness in that gesture broke something inside him, or maybe fixed something that propaganda had broken years ago. Hans thought about his mother's kitchen, the smell of fresh bread baking, the way sunlight came through the windows in the morning, the taste of real butter on warm rye. He hadn't seen food like that since 1943. The war had taken everything. Taken his father dead at Stalingrad, his older brother missing somewhere in Russia, his childhood burned away in a conflict he never understood or wanted. And now the Americans had won. The war was ending. Everyone knew it. Hans was a prisoner, but the American guards treated him better than his own officers ever had. They gave him food, real food. Not much, but more than the starvation rations the Wehrmacht had been distributing for the last year. Yesterday, an American sergeant had tossed him a piece of cornbread. Hans had stared at it like he'd never seen bread before, because he hadn't. Not bread that smelled like that. Sweet, rich, golden. The sergeant had laughed. Not cruel, friendly. Eat up, kid. You look like you needs it. Hans had eaten that cornbread slowly, savoring every bite, letting the taste of it fill his mouth. It was still warm. When had he last eaten warm bread? He couldn't remember. The sergeant had watched him with something like pity. When's the last time you ate real food, soldier? Hans had answered honestly. 43, before everything collapsed. The sergeant had nodded, pulled out another piece, handed it over. Here, and kid the people in those barracks, the prisoners. You're going to help us take care of them. You understand? Hans had understood. This was punishment, or maybe justice. He'd worn the uniform, even if he'd never fired a shot at civilians, even if he'd been just a conscript who'd spent most of the war doing logistics in farm labor for the Wehrmacht. He'd still been part of it, part of the machine that created this nightmare. Yes, sir, Hans had said. I understand. But he hadn't understood. Not really. Not until he started carrying those prisoners. Not until he saw what his country had done, what he'd been told to accept as necessary, what propaganda had made seem righteous. Now he lay in the dark and knew the truth. Everything he'd been taught was a lie. And somehow, impossibly, the American enemy was showing him what humanity actually looked like. The next morning, May 3rd, Lieutenant Colonel Jake Silverman walked into the command meeting with a folder full of numbers and a plan that would probably get him court-martialed. The tent was packed. British liaison officers, American medical staff, logistics commanders, senior officers from division. Maps covered every table. Charts showed death rates climbing like a fever that would not break. Colonel Morrison, chief medical officer, was presenting the grim statistics, graphs tracking the death toll, projections showing the future. His conclusion was matter-of-fact and devastating. Gentlemen, we are doing everything possible with the resources available. We project 22,000 additional casualties over the next 60 days, even with optimal medical care. Given the condition these prisoners are in, we should consider ourselves fortunate if half of them survive. The room accepted this with heavy silence. 22,000 more deaths. Just the price of liberation. A tragic but unavoidable outcome. The experts had spoken. The best minds in military medicine had reached their conclusion. The doctors would continue their work, follow their training, and accept what they could not change. Jake stood up. Every eye in the tent turned to him. He was the junior officer here, the infantry commander with no medical background, trying to talk to experts. He opened his folder and began. I propose we evacuate 28,000 prisoners within 8 days. The silence broke into laughter, then angry murmurs, then outright dismissal. Morrison stood up, his face red. You want to move dying patients, Lieutenant Colonel? You will kill them faster than the typhus. Sit down and leave medicine to the doctors. Jake did not sit down. He pulled out his first page of calculations. Right now, 400 people die here every day. That is a 12% daily death rate. If we move them to clean facilities with proper spacing, even if we lose 3% during transport, we still save 9%. That is 270 lives per day. Every day we wait, we lose those lives. His voice was steady, but his hands gripped the folder tight enough to crumple the pages. The medical staff pushed back hard. Moving critical patients required ambulances, trained transport teams, proper equipment. They had none of that. The roads were damaged from war. The weather was cold and wet. Patients would die in the backs of trucks, bouncing over rough roads, bleeding out, or going into shock before reaching any destination. It was madness, logistically impossible, medically irresponsible. Jake asked for one chance to prove his theory. Give me 500 of the sickest patients. Give me whatever trucks you can spare. Let me move them 12 kilometers to Furstenfeldbruck. If I am wrong, I will never question medical decisions again. The room erupted in arguments, voices talking over each other, medical officers citing textbooks, logistics commanders explaining why it could not work. The noise built like pressure in a sealed container until finally a single voice cut through. Brigadier General Frank Patterson stepped forward, Deputy Director of Medical Service, a career military doctor with 30 years of battlefield experience. He was a man whose opinion carried weight even among colonels and generals. He looked at Jake, then at the death rate charts, then back at Jake. You get your test, Lieutenant Colonel. 500 patients, 24 hours to show results. If your death rate is higher than ours, this conversation ends forever. His voice held no warmth. This was not encouragement. This was a rope being handed to a man who would probably hang himself with it. Jake understood perfectly. He saluted. Thank you, sir. Patterson's expression did not change. Do not thank me yet, son. If those people die because of your theory, you will carry that weight for the rest of your life. Jake walked out of that tent knowing he had until dawn to organize the impossible. 500 lives hung on a theory that contradicted every medical textbook. The doctors expected him to fail spectacularly. He expected them to be right, but 400 people were dying every day. And Jake Silverman would rather be spectacularly wrong trying to save them than respectably right watching them die. Dawn came cold and gray over Dachau. Jake had spent the night commandeering vehicles, 18 trucks total, German Wehrmacht transports captured from the retreating army, liberated civilian buses from Munich, 2 functioning U.S. Army ambulances, the only medical vehicles available, even 3 horse-drawn wagons from local farms. Whatever could move would move people. He gathered medical orderlies, nurses, volunteers willing to try something insane. The plan was precise. Each patient would receive 1,200 calories of food before transport, spread over 6 small meals. Bodies needed fuel before they could handle the stress of movement. Water would be rationed at half a liter every 2 hours. No exceptions. Too much too fast had killed dozens already. They loaded the first truck at 0600. Hans Weber was part of the loading crew. 20 German POWs assigned to carry patients on stretchers. Hans lifted an old man who could not have weighed more than 75 pounds. All bones and skin stretched tight. The man's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. Hans moved as gently as possible, but even that seemed too rough. An American medic walked alongside. Easy with him. His name is Samuel. He has typhus and malnutrition. Probably has maybe 48 hours if we leave him here. Hans adjusted his grip, cradling the man like he would a child. Samuel's eyes opened, focused on Hans, saw the German uniform. Fear flooded those sunken eyes. The medic put a hand on Samuel's shoulder. It's okay. He is helping us. He is going to carry you to the truck. "You are getting out of here." Samuel whispered something in Yiddish. The medic translated for Hans. "He is thanking you for being gentle." Hans felt tears burn his eyes. This man, this Jewish man, who had every reason to hate him, was thanking him. Hans wanted to say he was sorry, wanted to explain that he had not known, had not understood. But what good would words do? So instead he just held Samuel carefully and walked him to the truck. Each truck held 20 patients, packed with blankets and hot water bottles, straw padding on the metal floors. Medical staff rode along monitoring vital signs ready to stop if anyone crashed. The 12-kilometer journey to Furstenfeldbruck would take 3 hours. Trucks moving at walking speed over roads cratered by bombs and tanks. Jake rode in the lead vehicle. Hans rode in truck 4, assigned to help the medical team. The convoy rolled out at 700 hours. Every bump brought gasps of pain from the cargo beds. The trucks moved slower than men walked, crawling over terrain that offered no mercy. 45 minutes into the journey, Truck 4's medic signaled stop. Hans saw him working frantically over a patient. Samuel, the old man Jake's medic had mentioned. His pulse was failing, going into shock. The medic looked up at the driver. "We need to turn back to Dachau Hospital now." Jake appeared from the lead truck, walked back through the convoy, looked at Samuel's gray face, made a decision. "Treat him here. We continue forward." The medic stared. "Sir, if we move him in this condition, then we move him in this condition. Turning back means admitting this does not work. Staying at Dachau means he dies anyway, so we treat him here and we keep moving." The medic swallowed hard, nodded. Began working in the truck bed. Hans watched, holding his breath. This old Jewish man being treated by Americans while a German prisoner stood by. The symbolism was not lost on him. 10 minutes later, Samuel's pulse stabilized. The convoy resumed. Hans exhaled for what felt like the first time in an hour. 90 minutes and Truck 7's transmission failed. 28 patients in a non-functioning vehicle. Jake made the call, redistribute them to other trucks. Now dangerously overcrowded. Continue anyway. Monitor closely. Hans helped transfer patients, felt their bones through skin. One woman, maybe 60, whispered to him in German, "Danke, junger Mann." "Thank you, young man," Hans broke. "I am sorry. I am so sorry for what we did." She touched his hand with skeletal fingers. Said nothing, but her eyes held something Hans had not expected. Not forgiveness, something stranger. Understanding. They reached Furstenfeldbruck at noon. The former Luftwaffe base had intact buildings, real floors, actual roofs, and the miracle Jake had bet everything on: space. At Dachau, 60 men shared rooms meant for 10. Here each patient got their own bed with 3 feet of separation on every side. Room for air to move. Room for disease not to spread like wildfire through packed bodies. Clean air could circulate. Medical staff could actually reach patients without stepping over other patients. Hans helped set up beds, watched American medics work with efficiency and care. This was the first time he'd seen medical treatment without cruelty, without selection, without deciding who deserved to live and who did not. A young American private, maybe 20, pulled out a thermos during a break. "Coffee time." He poured cups for everyone, including the German POWs. Hans stared at the cup being offered to him. "Sir, this is for prisoners." The private laughed. "You have been hauling dying people all morning." "Yeah, you get coffee." Hans took the cup, brought it to his lips. The smell hit first. Rich, dark. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute he had been drinking for years. He tasted it, hot, strong. They'd added sugar and cream, luxuries he had not seen since before the war turned bad. Tears ran down his face. The private looked concerned. "That bad?" Hans shook his head. "No, it is perfect. I have not tasted real coffee in so long." The private sat down next to him. "Where you from, kid?" "Bavaria. My family has farm, dairy cows." "No kidding, I am from Wisconsin. We have dairy farms too." The private grinned. "Bet your cows give good milk." Hans started crying harder, not from sadness, from the shock of normalcy. This American soldier was talking to him like he was human, like they were just 2 farm boys from different places, like war had not made them enemies. You talk to me like I am a person, Hans managed. The private's expression softened. You are a person, kid. You made mistakes. We all do. But right now, you are helping fix things. That counts for something. 24 hours later, Jake stood in the Furstenfeldbruck barracks holding the results. He had not slept, had walked between beds all night, counting, checking, hoping the numbers would prove him right. Deaths at Furstenfeldbruck, 14 patients, 2 during transport, 12 in the first 24 hours. Total mortality rate, 2.80%. The control group at Dachau, same 500 patient demographic, same conditions, stayed behind at the main camp. 58 deaths in 24 hours, 11.6% mortality. The math was undeniable. Jake had saved 44 lives in one day with one convoy. Extrapolate that across 60 days, across 28,000 prisoners, 15,000 lives or more. General Patterson arrived at the site personally, walked through the barracks, talked to medical staff, checked on patients, found Samuel the old man who had crashed during transport, alive, stable, fever-breaking. Patterson reviewed the numbers 3 times, looked at the patients actually responding to treatment now that they could breathe clean air, saw what the statistics proved. Space was medicine. Separation was survival. He found Jake outside the barracks. Lieutenant Colonel Silverman, you are authorized for full-scale evacuation. I am giving you 300 vehicles, 1,500 German POWs for labor, and 600 medical personnel. You have 8 days to move 28,000 people. Jake felt relief flood through him. Then Patterson continued. There is one condition. Division Command does not know about this yet. We are doing it first, asking permission after. If this goes wrong, we both face court-martial. Jake understood. Patterson was risking his career, his reputation, everything for the chance to save lives. The old general extended his hand. Jake shook it. We will not fail, sir. See that you don't, son, because if you do, it ends both of us. Hans overheard the conversation from where he was stacking medical supplies. 1,500 German POWs being mobilized to help evacuate Jews. The irony was so thick he could taste it. But more than irony, he felt something else. Purpose. He approached Jake carefully, saluted. Sir, I want to volunteer for your crew. I want to help. Jake studied this young German soldier who had carried dying people with such care. You will work harder than you have ever worked, and you will treat these people with dignity. Every one of them. Yes, sir, I understand now what dignity means. Jake nodded slowly, saw something in this kid's eyes that reminded him why he was doing this. Not just to save lives. To prove that humanity could survive even hell. That enemies could become something else. Something better. Welcome aboard, soldier. We move out tomorrow at dawn. 28,000 people are counting on us to do the impossible. Hans saluted again. We will not fail them, sir. Jake looked at this 19-year-old German who'd been taught to hate Jews and was now volunteering to save them. Looked at the barracks full of people who were finally impossibly starting to heal. Looked at the numbers that proved the experts wrong. 27,500 more people waited at Dachau. 8 days to move them all. Every decision could mean the difference between hundreds living or dying. The doctors still thought he was insane. Division Command would probably try to stop him. And if anything went catastrophically wrong, court-martial was waiting. But 400 people had been dying every day. Now it was 80. And tomorrow, if this worked, it might be 60, or 40, or 20. Jake Silverman had come to Dachau to help liberate prisoners. Instead, he'd learned that liberation was not a moment. It was a process. It was trucks and barracks and medical care and 1,000 small decisions that meant the difference between surviving freedom and dying from it. The sun set over Bavaria. In the morning, the impossible would continue. 27,500 reasons to keep breaking rules. To keep proving that sometimes saving lives means risking everything, including your career, your reputation, your freedom. But most of all, your certainty that you know the right way to do things. Because sometimes the right way gets people killed, and the crazy way saves them. May 5th, 1945. The second day of the impossible, Jake Silverman stood in the back of a captured German truck that served as his mobile headquarters. Maps covered every surface. Lists of locations, patient counts, vehicle assignments. 12 sites across Bavaria were being converted into makeshift hospitals overnight. Former SS barracks, schoolhouses, monasteries, warehouses, anywhere with a roof and four walls. The operation scope was staggering. 28,000 prisoners, 12 locations, 8 days. That meant moving 3,500 people every single day. Each site needed beds, food, water, medicine, heating, and medical staff. They had to convert German infrastructure into functioning hospitals while the patients were already in transit. Jake created a color-coded system. Red tags for the critical cases, move them first shortest distances, yellow tags for severe but stable, medium distances, green tags for those who could handle longer journeys. Every patient had to be evaluated, tagged, and assigned to a convoy route, all while people were still dying at a rate of 80 per day. The math haunted him. 80 per day was better than 400, but it was still 80 souls, 80 faces, 80 people who had survived 12 years of Nazi hell only to die in the first week of freedom. Not good enough, not even close. Hans Weber spent that second day at Site 3, a Bavarian monastery. The monks had agreed to house 2,000 prisoners. They were old men, these monks, too old for war. They moved slowly through their ancient building, preparing rooms that had held prayer and contemplation for centuries to now hold suffering and healing. Hans and 19 other German POWs worked under the supervision of American Sergeant Williams, a big man from Wisconsin with hands like slabs of beef and a surprisingly gentle voice. They were setting up beds, real beds with actual mattresses. Hans had not slept on a real mattress in 3 years. At 1000 hours, Sergeant Williams called a break, pulled out a thermos. "Coffee time, boys." He poured real coffee for everyone, including the German prisoners. Hans took his cup with shaking hands. The smell alone was almost too much. Rich and dark and real. He had not tasted genuine coffee since 1943. Everything after that had been chicory and burned grain, substitutes that mocked the memory of the real thing. He brought the cup to his lips. Hot, strong, sweet. They had added sugar and cream, luxuries that had disappeared from Germany when the war turned. William sat down on a crate next to him. "Where you from, kid?" "Bavaria, sir. My family has farm near Munich. Dairy cows." Williams grinned. "No kidding. Wisconsin. We got dairy farms too. Bet your cows give good milk." Hans started crying. Could not help it. Could not stop it. This American soldier, this enemy, was talking to him about cows, about farms, about normal things that had nothing to do with wuss or hate or propaganda, like they were just two farmers from different places. "You talk to me like I am human," Hans said through tears. Williams's expression softened. "You are human, kid. You made mistakes. Hell, we all make mistakes, but right now you are helping fix things. That counts for something." Hans looked at his coffee, at this small kindness, at the evidence that everything he had been taught was a lie. The Americans were not monsters. They were not cruel or inhuman. They were just people. People who treated even their enemies with basic dignity. "Thank you, sir," Hans whispered. Williams clapped him on the shoulder. "Finish that coffee. We got 2,000 beds to set up before the trucks arrive tomorrow." Day 3, May 7th. Site 5, a converted warehouse in Augsburg. The convoy arrived at 1400 hours. Hans was part of the unloading crew. 20 trucks carrying 400 patients. He moved from vehicle to vehicle, lifting people who weighed almost nothing, carrying them as gently as he could, each face a reminder of what his country had done. One woman, maybe 68 years old, was too weak to move on her own. Typhus and pneumonia. The American medic told Hans her name was Ruth, that she probably had 24 hours if the typhus was not contained. Hans knelt beside the truck bed, spoke softly in German. "Ich werde Sie nicht verletzen." "I will not hurt you." Ruth looked at him, saw the German uniform. Terror flooded her eyes. She tried to pull away. The medic put a hand on her shoulder. "Ruth, he is going to help carry you. He will be gentle, I promise." Hans lifted her carefully. She weighed perhaps 80 pounds. All bones and paper skin stretched over a frame that had once been larger. She trembled in his arms, from fear or cold or both. As he walked her to the isolation ward the Americans had set up, Ruth stared at his face. Hans felt her gaze, felt the weight of it more than the weight of her body. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. So young, just a boy. She touched his cheek with skeletal fingers. The kindness in that gesture broke Hans completely. This woman who had every reason to hate him, who wore the evidence of German cruelty on her bones. She saw him as a boy, as human. Hans set her gently on the bed, tucked the blanket around her. I am sorry, he said in German. I am so sorry. Ruth said nothing, just closed her eyes, but her hand found his and squeezed weakly before he left. Outside the ward, Lieutenant Foster, the American medic, found Hans sitting against a wall, crying. You okay, soldier? Hans looked up. I wore the uniform. I believe the lies. How do I live with that? Foster sat down beside him. By doing what you are doing now, by choosing better, by being the man you should have been. He pulled something from his pocket, a chocolate bar. Hershey's. The wrapper was brown and white and somehow represented everything America meant. Abundance, sweetness, simple pleasures that Germany had forgotten existed. Here, American medicine for the soul. Hans took the chocolate, broke off a piece, put it in his mouth. The taste hit him like a memory he had not known he was missing. Sweet and rich and real. He had not had chocolate in 4 years. Not since he was 15. For the war consumed everything. He tasted it and cried and understood something fundamental. The Americans had won not just because of their weapons or their numbers. They had won because they had kept their humanity. They could give chocolate to a German prisoner while helping Jewish survivors. They could see enemies and victims and still treat both with dignity. That evening, some of the American soldiers played baseball outside the warehouse. Hans watched from where he was stacking medical crates. He had never seen baseball before. In Germany, it was football, what the Americans called soccer. One ball went wild, rolled to Hans's feet. He picked it up, stared at it, felt the stitching under his fingers. Throw it here, Hans. Private Johnson, maybe 20 years old, blonde hair and an easy smile. Hans threw the ball awkwardly. It went wide. Johnson laughed, not cruel, friendly. Man, we got to teach you. For the next 15 minutes, Johnson gave Hans an impromptu baseball lesson. How to throw, how to catch, the basic rules. Hans laughed for the first time in months, maybe years, just a moment of being a 19-year-old kid playing a game. Johnson tossed him the ball one more time. When the war is over, you come to America. We will take you to a Yankees game. Hans caught it, held it. I would like that very much. Deal. Johnson grinned. And hey, you are getting better already. Natural athlete. Hans went to sleep that night holding the baseball they had let him keep. A gift from an enemy who had become something else. A friend. Maybe the first real friend he had made since the war began. Day 3 also brought the reckoning Jake had known was coming. At 1600 hours, a runner arrived from division headquarters. Lieutenant Colonel Silverman was ordered to report immediately to Major General Clearwater. Jake's stomach dropped. Division command had found out. He rode to headquarters in a jeep, walked into a room full of senior officers who looked at him like he had committed murder. Clearwater stood behind his desk. 3 full colonels flanked him. Their expressions ranged from angry to furious. By what authority? Clearwater said, his voice cold enough to freeze blood. Did you commandeer 300 vehicles, use 1,500 enemy prisoners for labor, and move 8,000 patients against explicit medical advice? Jake stood at attention, said nothing. I asked you a question, Lieutenant Colonel. No authority, sir. I acted on Brigadier General Patterson's approval for the test operation and extended it to full scale, without consulting division command. Correct, sir. Oh no. Clearwater's face went red. You are aware that unauthorized use of enemy resources, reckless endangerment of liberated civilians, and insubordination are all court-martial offenses. I am aware, sir. Then explain to me why I should not convene a court-martial right now. Jake met Clearwater's eyes. 8,000 have been moved so far. Death rate during and after transport is 3%. At the main camp, the rate for the same time period was 12%. That is 720 lives saved, sir. That is luck, Lieutenant Colonel. Luck that could run out at any moment. When it does, when a convoy crashes or an outbreak kills hundreds, you will be responsible. Yes, sir, I accept that responsibility. One of the colonels stepped forward. This operation is a logistical disaster. You have vehicles scattered across Bavaria, German prisoners handling American operations. No centralized command structure. It is chaos. It is organized chaos, sir, and it is working. The door opened. Brigadier General Patterson entered without being announced. He walked to stand beside Jake. The room went silent. General Clearwater said carefully, "This does not concern you." "With respect, sir, it does. I authorized Lieutenant Colonel Silverman's operation." "You authorized a test, not a full-scale evacuation." Patterson pulled a thick folder from under his arm, set it on Clearwater's desk. "These are medical reports, death certificates, survival statistics. Projected casualties by end of May were 22,000. Actual casualties so far are 600. Lieutenant Colonel Silverman has saved 16,000 lives and counting. Or gotten lucky 16,000 times. Sir," Patterson's voice went hard, "you can court-martial us both if you want. But first you will need to explain to Stars and Stripes, to the War Department, and to the American people why you punished the officers who saved Dachau." The standoff lasted 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes. Finally, Clearwater spoke. "If one convoy crashes, if one outbreak kills hundreds, if your mortality rate ever exceeds standard protocol, this ends, and you both face charges. Am I clear?" "Crystal clear, sir," Jake said. Dismissed. Jake and Patterson walked out together. Once outside, Patterson stopped. "That was too close, son." "I know, sir, thank you." "Do not thank me yet. We still have 20,000 people to move. And now Clearwater is watching for any mistake. Any at all." Jake understood. The margin for error had just become zero. Day 4, May 8th. Site 7, another monastery. The morning started with a crisis. 23 new typhus cases overnight. The isolation protocols had failed. Disease was spreading through the patient population faster than antibiotics could contain it. Jake arrived at 00700. Found medical staff overwhelmed. Found patients crowded into improvised isolation wards that were not big enough. Found the beginning of exactly the outbreak Clearwater had warned about. He made decisions rapidly. Commandeer the entire east wing of the monastery. Convert it to isolation only. Move every suspected case immediately. Separate confirmed cases by severity. Triple the medical staff assigned to typhus treatment. Requisition every ampule of antibiotics within 50 kilometers. Hans was assigned to the isolation team. His job was to move infected patients to the new ward. Each one was a gamble. Each touch risked infection. But Hans did not hesitate. The critical case was an elderly woman, 70 years old. Typhus, pneumonia, malnutrition, the trifecta of death. She was unconscious when Hans lifted her. Her breathing was shallow and rattling. The medic said she had maybe 6 hours. Hans carried her to isolation, laid her on a clean bed, tucked the blanket around her, whispered in German even though she could not hear, "You are safe now. The Americans will take care of you." He stayed with her for 3 hours, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, watching her breathe, praying to a God he was not sure he believed in anymore. At hour 4, her fever broke. Her breathing eased. Her eyes opened. She looked at Hans, at his German uniform, and instead of fear, she smiled weakly. "Danke," she whispered. "Thank you." Hans broke down crying. This woman who should hate him was thanking him. The medics had to pull him away so he could compose himself. Lieutenant Foster found him outside. "Hans, you okay?" "I do not deserve their kindness, after everything." "Maybe not, but you are getting it anyway. That is what mercy looks like." The outbreak was contained by 1800 hours. 4 deaths. Could have been 40. Should have been 40. Jake's rapid response had prevented catastrophe, but those 4 deaths haunted him. 4 more faces added to the 840 total. Not good enough, still not good enough. Day 5, May 9th, the near disaster that almost ended everything. A convoy of 15 trucks carrying 300 patients was en route to Site 9. The designated bridge had collapsed. Wehrmacht engineers had blown it during their retreat weeks earlier. Intelligence had said it was intact. Intelligence was wrong. Alternative road added 2 hours, 2 hours of exposure. Cold weather, patients already hypothermic, risk of massive casualties. Jake rode in the lead truck, made the decision, proceed slowly on the alternate route, monitor every patient constantly, stop at first sign of distress. Hans was in truck 4 with Jake, watching the lieutenant colonel make impossible calculations in real time. Speed versus safety, time versus exposure, lives versus logistics. 30 minutes into the detour, a patient started coding. 19-year-old boy, same age as Hans. Typhus and exposure, going into shock in the back of a bouncing truck. The medic worked frantically. Chest compressions, artificial respiration, injections. Hans watched, held his breath, prayed harder than he had ever prayed. "Please, God," he whispered in German, "please do not let him die." 8 minutes of emergency treatment in a moving truck. The medic's hands never stopped, never hesitated. Finally, the boy's pulse stabilized, his breathing returned. Hans exhaled, realized he had been holding his breath the entire time, realized tears were streaming down his face. Jake noticed, "You care about them." Hans met his eyes. "I should have cared before it was too late." "It is not too late. You are helping save them now." All 15 trucks arrived at Site 9. No deaths, no serious complications. Just 300 more people given a chance to heal in clean air and open space. But it had been close. Too close. Jake knew Clearwater would hear about it, knew the scrutiny would intensify, knew that one actual disaster would end everything. Day 6, May 10th. Victory in Europe Day. The war officially ended. Germany surrendered. Throughout Europe, soldiers celebrated. Champagne, fireworks, dancing in the streets. Years of death and destruction finally over. Jake barely noticed. He was planning Day 7's convoy routes. 2,200 more patients to move. 2 more days after this. The war ending meant nothing if these people died free. Hans heard the celebrations, heard American soldiers cheering, drinking, singing. His country had lost. Everything his father and brother had died for. Lost. And somehow Hans felt relief. The nightmare was over. Maybe now Germany could become something better than what propaganda had made it. Sergeant Williams found him stacking medical supplies. "It is over. Hans' war is over." Hans nodded. "For you, for me, the hardest work is just beginning." "What do you mean, living with what I did?" "What I did not stop. What I believed." Williams' expression went serious. "Yeah, I guess that is true. But you know what? You get to start over. Make different choices. Be different. That is what peace means." That evening, the American cooks made a special meal. Victory celebration. They cooked for everyone, including the German POWs. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, fresh bread, apple pie. Hans sat at a long table with American soldiers. This would have been unthinkable a week ago. Enemy and victor eating together. But here it was, happening. Corporal Martinez, a cook from Texas, piled food on Hans's plate. "Try the chicken, man. My grandmother's recipe." Hans bit into the fried chicken. Crispy skin, juicy meat inside, seasoned with spices he could not name but tasted like heaven. He had not eaten meat like this in 4 years. Not since before rationing made meat a memory. Tears ran down his face. Again. He seemed to cry every day now, breaking years of numbness in constant waves. Martinez looked concerned. "That bad?" Hans shook his head. "No, it is perfect. I do not deserve this kindness. After everything." Martinez sat down across from him. "Maybe you do not, but you are getting it anyway. That is what America does. We beat you. Now we feed you. Tomorrow we will help you rebuild. That is how we do things." Hans ate slowly, savoring every bite, understanding something fundamental. The Americans had not just won the war. They had won because they fought for something bigger than hate. They fought for a world where even enemies could sit together and eat fried chicken and talk about grandmother's recipes. Day 8, May 12th, the final convoy. The last 400 patients from Dachau main camp loaded at dawn, Jake rode with them. Hans rode shotgun. After 8 days of working together, the American officer and the German prisoner had developed something like trust, maybe even friendship. The trucks rolled out at 0600. The roads were familiar now. Every crater memorized, every turn anticipated. The convoy moved with practiced efficiency. At 1600 hours, they arrived at Site 12. The final destination. Hans helped unload the last patients, set them in beds, covered them with blankets, watched American medics begin their work. Jake stood outside the building, holding papers covered in numbers. His hands shook, not from exhaustion, though he was exhausted, from the weight of what those numbers meant. Total evacuated 28,000 prisoners. Deaths during 8-day operation 840. That was 3% mortality. Projected deaths if they had stayed at Dachau 3,360. That was 12% mortality. Lives saved 2,520. 2,520 human beings who were breathing because Jake Silverman had refused to follow the rules. Because he had bet everything on a crazy theory. Because he had been willing to be spectacularly wrong if it meant a chance to be miraculously right. Medical treatments were working now, wounds healing, fevers breaking, bodies recovering. The combination of space and medicine was creating miracles. Jake allowed himself one moment of relief, just one, then back to work. 2,520 people saved meant 840 people lost, 840 faces he would carry forever. Hans found him at sunset. They sat on a truck tailgate, both exhausted beyond words, watching the sun set over Bavaria. The war was over. The impossible was done. What came next, neither knew. What happens to us now, Hans asked. The prisoners, I mean. Eventually you go home. Rebuild Germany. Hans was quiet for a long time. I do not know if I can face my father. He was a Nazi party member. Believed everything. You will face him. You will tell him the truth. That is how Germany heals. Hans pulled out a small notebook. He had been writing in it all week. Observations, sketches, memories. He showed Jake a drawing. An American soldier giving coffee to a German prisoner. You drew this. I want to remember. I want to tell people what really happened here. Jake studied the sketch. Then promise me something. Promise you will tell the truth, even when it is hard. I promise, sir. They shook hands. Former enemies. Now something else. Not quite friends, not quite brothers, but connected by 8 days of shared impossible work. If you ever make it to America, Jake said, look me up, Brooklyn, New York, Silverman's Hardware. Hans smiled. Silverman's Hardware. I will remember. And Hans, you are a good man. Do not forget that. 2 weeks later, the official reports were filed. Division Command documented the Dachau evacuation. They credited improved medical coordination, enhanced treatment protocols, innovative satellite facility approaches. They listed senior medical officers by name, Colonel Morrison, General Patterson. Others, Lieutenant Colonel Jacob Silverman's name appeared nowhere. Hans Weber, German prisoner number 4732, was not mentioned at all. The operation was attributed to collaborative efforts of division medical staff. Professional military medicine solving an unprecedented crisis through proper channels and expert protocols. Jake received a Bronze Star for meritorious service in medical logistics. No specific citation about Dachau. At the ceremony, he said nothing, did not fight for recognition, did not demand credit. 28,000 people were breathing. That was his medal, the only one that mattered. General Patterson pulled him aside after the ceremony. They are not ready to admit an infantry officer revolutionized combat medicine. I understand, sir. Your methods will be adopted. Your name will not be attached. I am sorry. Jake looked at the Bronze Star in its case. General, those people are alive. I can live with being forgotten. Patterson nodded slowly. You are a better man than I am, son. Hans was transferred to an American POW camp in France, eventually repatriated to Germany in 1946. He took his notebook with him, took Jake's words, tell the truth, even when it is hard. He would spend the rest of his life keeping that promise. But neither man knew as they parted in May of 45 that they would meet again. That 40 years later, two old men would sit in a Brooklyn hardware store and remember 8 days when enemies became brothers and the impossible became real. For now, they just said goodbye. Two soldiers who had met in hell and found humanity, who had proven that kindness was stronger than hate, that mercy defeated cruelty, that sometimes the most important thing one person can do is show another person a better way to be human. The sun set over Bavaria. The truck sat empty. The patients healed in their scattered hospitals. And somewhere in the bureaucracy papers were filed that erased the names of the men who had saved them. But 840 families mourned, and 2,520 families celebrated. And the difference between those numbers was a young American officer who broke every rule and a young German prisoner who chose redemption. History would forget their names, but 28,000 people remembered their faces. That would have to be enough. Brooklyn, New York, summer of 1946. Jacob Silverman came home to a hero's welcome from the Jewish community. Not for Dachau. Nobody knew about Dachau. The welcome was for being a Jewish American officer who had survived D-Day the Bulge in the liberation of Europe, for wearing the uniform with pride, for coming home alive when so many had not. He opened Silverman's hardware store on Atlantic Avenue using his GI Bill benefits. The storefront was small, crowded shelves of nails and hammers and paint cans, the smell of sawdust and motor oil, a brass bell that rang when customers entered. Normal, blessedly, perfectly normal. He met Sarah Cohen at synagogue that fall. She had kind eyes and a practical mind and did not ask too many questions about the war. They married in the spring of 47, had their first child, Rachel, in 48, then David in 50, then Rebecca in 52. Jake became a fixture in the neighborhood, the hardware store owner who always knew which tool you needed, who could fix anything, who gave fair prices and honest advice. He coached Little League on weekends, watched Dodgers games on the new television, made pancakes for his kids on Saturday mornings. Nobody knew about the 8 days. Nobody knew about 28,000 lives. When people asked about his service, Jake mentioned D-Day, mentioned liberating towns in France and Germany. Never mentioned Dachau. Never mentioned the evacuation. It was not modesty. It was something deeper. Something that happened when a person saw the absolute worst of humanity and then had to live in a world that wanted to forget. The weight of 840 faces. The weight of decisions that meant life or death. The weight of being right when all the experts were wrong. Too heavy to share with people who were not there. Sarah knew he was hiding something, knew he woke up some nights in cold sweats, knew he kept a duffel bag in the basement that he never opened but also never threw away. She never pushed, just held him when the nightmares came. Just loved the man he was trying to become instead of the soldier he had been. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Hans Weber returned to a Germany that did not exist anymore. Bavaria, winter of 1946. The farm where Hans had grown up was still standing. Barely. His father was dead. Killed at Stalingrad in 43. His mother had remarried. A man named Friedrich, who had been a local Nazi Party official, who was bitter about the defeat, who drank too much and blamed everyone but himself. Hans tried to tell the truth, tried to explain what he had seen at Dachau, what the Americans had taught him about humanity and mercy and kindness. Friedrich called it American propaganda, called Hans a traitor for believing it, said the camps were exaggerated, that the Jews had deserved whatever happened, that Germany had been stabbed in the back. Hans lasted 3 weeks. Then he took what little money he had and moved to Munich, found work on a construction crew rebuilding the city. The physical labor was hard but honest. He slept in a boarding house with other young men trying to piece together lives from the rubble. He kept his notebook, kept his promise to Jake, started talking to anyone who would listen. In beer halls, at work sites, to teachers who were trying to figure out how to educate the next generation without the poison of Nazi ideology. I was there, Hans would say. I wore the uniform. I believed the lies. But I saw the truth. The camps were real. The atrocities were real. And the Americans showed me that humanity survives even hell. Some people listened. Many did not. Germany was still processing its shame, still deciding whether to confront the past or bury it. But Hans kept talking, kept drawing, kept telling the truth even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. In 1947, he wrote a letter to Jake, addressed it to Silverman's Hardware, Brooklyn, New York, USA, thanked him for showing him what it meant to be human, described his life rebuilding Germany, included a sketch of an American and German soldiers shaking hands. The letter never arrived, lost in the chaos of post-war international mail. But Hans kept writing, kept trying, kept hoping that somehow Jake would know he had kept his promise. The years passed. Both men built lives, had families, grew older. The war became history, then memory, then something their children studied in school but could not really understand. But in military planning rooms, something was happening, something neither man knew about. Washington, D.C., Pentagon, 1948. A committee of military medical officers was studying World War II humanitarian operations, trying to extract lessons, trying to develop protocols for future conflicts. They had access to all the after-action reports, all the casualty statistics, all the medical data from the liberation of concentration camps. The Dachau evacuation data was there, buried in division medical staff reports. No attribution to individuals, just the numbers. 28,000 evacuated, 12 sites, 8 days, 3% mortality during operation versus 12% at main camp, 85% reduction in deaths. The committee studied those numbers for months, analyzed the methods, the satellite facility approach, the priority evacuation of critical cases, the maintenance of medical care during transport, the emphasis on spacing and environmental modification over intensive individual treatment. They saw genius in it, revolutionary thinking that contradicted standard medical doctrine but produced undeniable results. In 1950, NATO adopted the Mass Casualty Evacuation Protocol, the official doctrine for handling large-scale humanitarian crises. Every method came directly from Dachau. Move the sickest first, maintain care during transport, and establish multiple small facilities instead of one large hospital, create space for medicine to work. Jake Silverman's name appeared nowhere in the document. The protocol was credited to collaborative research by NATO medical committees based on World War II lessons learned. His fingerprints were on every page. His name was absent from every citation. Korea, winter of 1950. The Chinese offensive pushed UN forces south in brutal retreat. Thousands of wounded soldiers and refugees in desperate conditions, sub-zero temperatures, overwhelmed medical facilities. The same impossible math that had faced Jake at Dachau. Medical officers pulled out the new NATO protocols, started evacuating en masse, moving entire field hospitals overnight, treating patients in vehicles, in trains and ships, creating satellite facilities spread across the peninsula. Traditional military doctors expected catastrophe, expected the evacuations to kill more than they saved. The survival rates shocked everyone. The protocols worked spectacularly. Jake's methods, unnamed and unattributed, were saving lives on a different continent in a different war. Back in Brooklyn, Jake watched the news reports, saw footage of helicopter medevacs, heard reporters describing the new evacuation protocols that were revolutionizing combat medicine. His son David, 8 years old, sat next to him. "Dad, did you do stuff like that in the war?" Jake smiled, ruffled his son's hair. "Something like that, buddy." "Were you a hero?" Jake thought about 840 faces, about 2,520 saved, about methods being used around the world with his name nowhere attached. "I was just a soldier, David. Did what needed doing." Sarah watched from the kitchen doorway, saw something in her husband's eyes. Pride, maybe, or grief, or both. Vietnam, 1968. Jake was 51 now, graying hair, reading glasses, 3 grown children. The hardware store, thriving. A grandfather twice over. He watched the evening news like millions of other Americans. Helicopter medevacs were the centerpiece of military medicine now. Wounded soldiers pulled from jungles and evacuated within minutes to facilities far from combat zones. MASH units mobile by design, ready to pack up and relocate whenever tactical situations demanded. The reporter explained the protocols. These rapid evacuation methods, pioneered during the Korean War, have saved thousands of American lives. Military medicine has evolved from treating patients where they fall to moving them quickly to facilities where proper care is possible. Jake's hands tightened on his coffee cup. Sarah noticed. "You okay, honey?" "Fine, just remembering something." That night he went to the basement, pulled out the old duffel bag, inside his bronze star, his dog tags, and one photograph. Jake and Hans sitting on a truck tailgate, May 12, 45. Two exhausted men who had done the impossible together. Jake traced Hans's face in the photo, wondered where he was, if he was alive, if he remembered, if he had kept his promise to tell the truth. "I hope you made it, kid," Jake whispered. "I hope you became the man I knew you could be." Munich, Germany, 1975. Hans Weber was 49, a successful architect who had helped rebuild dozens of buildings destroyed by Allied bombing. Married young, had two children, lost his wife to cancer in 73. His grief was still fresh. But through it all, he had kept his promise, had spent 30 years telling the truth about the camps, about what he had seen, about what the Americans had taught him. He spoke in schools, at universities, at remembrance ceremonies. His notebook, now worn and fragile, went everywhere with him. His son Ernst, 22, asked him once why he did it, why he kept telling a story that made him uncomfortable, that marked him as different from other Germans who preferred to move on. "Because I promised," Hans said. "I promised an American officer that I would tell the truth, even when it is hard, especially when it is hard. But nobody knows his name. Nobody credits him." Hans smiled sadly. "He does not need credit. He saved 28,000 lives. That is his monument. I am just making sure the world does not forget how he did it." The years continued. The 70s became the 80s. Both men grew older. The war became something from a different lifetime, a different world. But in 1982, two searches began. New York City, Holocaust Memorial Organization. The organization was planning Dachau liberation reunions, gathering survivor testimonies, recording oral histories before the generation passed. Dozens of survivors mentioned the same thing: a young American officer who had organized an evacuation, who had fought the doctors, who had moved them when medical experts said movement would kill them. They described him: Jewish, 28 years old and 45, Brooklyn accent, yelled at supply sergeants in Yiddish, walked through the facilities every night checking on patients, treated them like human beings worth saving instead of problems too difficult to solve. The survivors wanted to find him, wanted to thank him, wanted the world to know his name. A researcher was hired, started digging through military records. The official reports credited division medical staff, but individual personnel files were different. Cross-referenced Jewish officers at Dachau, April through May 45, found one name that matched all the descriptions: Jacob Silverman, Lieutenant Colonel, Infantry, present at Dachau during evacuation. Last known address from VA records, Brooklyn, New York. The researcher made phone calls, found the hardware store, still operating, still owned by the same family. 3 survivors decided to make the trip: David Rosenberg, 78, Samuel Cohen, 82, Abraham Stein, 75. They booked flights to New York for September of 82. Meanwhile, in Munich, Hans Weber made his own decision. He was 56, approaching retirement. His children were grown. He had spent 37 years keeping his promise, teaching truth, fighting lies. But there was one more thing he needed to do. He needed to find Jake, needed to thank him personally, needed him to know that the promise had been kept. Hans booked a flight to New York. September of 82. He had the address: Silverman's Hardware, Brooklyn. He had carried it in his heart for 37 years. September 15th, 1982, Wednesday afternoon. Jake was 65, still ran the hardware store, though his son David helped now. White hair, thick glasses, hands gnarled from decades of work but still strong, still capable. The bell above the door rang. 3 elderly men entered. They moved slowly, looked around the store like they were searching for something specific. Finally approached the counter. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Jake asked. The shortest one, completely bald with kind eyes, spoke. "Yes, you saved my life 37 years ago. We came to say thank you." Jake froze, stared at them, did not recognize the faces. Decades had changed everyone, but the eyes, there was something in the eyes. "I'm sorry, I think you have me confused with someone else." David Rosenberg shook his head. "No confusion. Dachau. In May of 45, you were the officer who organized the evacuation, who moved us when the doctors said it would kill us. You gave us blankets and food and space to breathe. The memories crashed over Jake like a wave. The trucks, the convoys, the faces. So many faces. I could not save everyone, Jake said quietly. 840 still died. You saved 28,000. Samuel Cohen's voice shook with emotion. I am standing here because you refused to let us die quietly. My children exist because of you. My grandchildren. Jake's eyes filled with tears. 37 years of silence breaking. 37 years of carrying the weight alone. I did not do enough. You did everything. Abraham Stein stepped forward, took Jake's hand. You were just a soldier doing his job, you said back then. But you were more than that. You were proof that humanity survived even in hell. The bell rang again. A tall man entered. Gray hair, weathered face, carrying a worn notebook. He saw Jake at the counter, stopped in the doorway. Jake looked up, saw the man, something in his posture, his bearing, and then he knew. Hans Weber smiled through tears. Herr Lieutenant Colonel Silverman. I kept my promise. The room went silent. The three survivors turned, saw the German man. Tension crackled. Jake came around the counter. Hans Weber, the kid from the dairy farm. My God, you are alive. Thanks to you, sir. They embraced. Two old men who had been young soldiers in a different world, who had met as enemies and parted as something better. Hans opened his notebook, showed Jake 37 years of sketches and observations and testimonies. I told the truth, like you asked. I never stopped. David Rosenberg approached slowly. Survivor facing former Wehrmacht soldier. He looked at Hans for a long moment. Hans met his gaze steadily, did not look away. You wore the uniform, David said. I did, and I am ashamed every day. But you helped save us. I tried. It was the least I could do. It will never be enough. David extended his hand. What you did after matters too. Thank you for telling the truth. They shook hands, both crying. Jake watched and understood something fundamental. This was what the 8 days had been for. Not just saving lives in that moment, but proving that mercy defeated hatred, that redemption was possible, that enemies could become human again. Jake took everyone to his favorite deli, Kornblum's 3 blocks away. They sat in a corner booth. Jake ordered a feast. Pastrami sandwiches piled high, matzo ball soup, pickles, coleslaw, black and white cookies. Hans bit into his pastrami sandwich. The taste exploded in his mouth, salty and peppery and rich. He laughed through tears. This is incredible. You never had a good sandwich until you have had Brooklyn pastrami, Jake said. They talked for 4 hours, memories tumbling out. Jake described the 8 days from his perspective, the impossible logistics, the fear of being wrong, the weight of 840 losses. Hans described returning to Germany, fighting to tell the truth, teaching in schools, keeping the promise. The survivors shared their stories too. Lives rebuilt from rubble, children and grandchildren born, careers and marriages and ordinary miracles. 28,000 saved in 45. How many descendants now? The survivors estimated maybe 150,000, maybe 200,000. Lives radiating outward from 8 days of impossible work. You know they erased your name from the official reports, David said. Credited it all to division medical staff. Jake shrugged. I know. Patterson told me at the time. Does that not make you angry? 28,000 people are breathing. That is the only credit that matters. Hans showed more drawings. The convoy routes, the satellite facilities. Jake and Hans shaking hands. American soldiers playing baseball with German prisoners. All of it preserved in fading pencil. I want you to have this, Hans said, offering the notebook to Jake. Jake pushed it back gently. No, you keep it. Keep telling the truth. That is more important than any recognition I could get. They parted that evening with promises to stay in touch, to write, to visit again. Jake gave Hans his home phone number. Hans gave Jake his address in Munich. The survivors exchanged information, made plans for reunions. When everyone had gone, Jake sat in his living room, Sarah beside him, both silent. "You never told me," she said softly. "I know." Why? Jake thought about how to explain. Because I was ashamed that I could not save them all. Because I was angry that my name was erased. Because carrying it alone seemed easier than sharing the weight. I was wrong. Sarah took his hand. "You are a good man, Jacob Silverman. I am just a man who did what needed doing. That is what good men always say." The reunion made local news. Brooklyn paper ran a story. Hometown hero saved 28,000 at Dachau. Veterans organizations took notice. Military historians began investigating. Slowly, carefully, Jake's story emerged from obscurity. He started speaking at Holocaust remembrance events. Brief talks, factual, soldiers' reports rather than heroes' speeches. He described logistics and death rates and convoy routes. Avoided drama, deflected credit to the medical staff and volunteers. But survivors testified, one by one, told what the official reports had erased. The young officer who fought the doctors, who broke the rules, who saved them when experts said they could not be saved. In 1997, Israel honored Jake at Yad Vashem. Quiet ceremony, no cameras, just recognition from a grateful nation. Jake was 80 years old. Sarah had passed in 95. Hans flew from Munich to be there. They sat together after the ceremony, two old men remembering when they were young. "We did something impossible," Hans said. "We did what needed doing," Jake replied. "Is there a difference?" Jake smiled. "Maybe not." Jake Silverman died in the year 2000, 83 years old. Heart failure. Peaceful in his sleep. His funeral was packed. Family, friends, survivors, strangers who had heard his story. They buried him with full military honors. Hans Weber died in 2005, 79 years old. Cancer. His children were with him at the end. His last words were in English, a language he had learned to honor his promise. "Tell them the truth, even when it is hard." But the story did not end with their deaths. Afghanistan, summer of 2015. Captain David Silverman, 32 years old, stood in a field hospital watching organized chaos. His grandfather's namesake, Jake's grandson, U.S. Army doctor assigned to a forward operating base near Kandahar. A suicide bombing had hit a marketplace. 40 wounded, civilians and soldiers mixed together. The field hospital was already at capacity, disease spreading through the crowded wards. The familiar, impossible math. David made a decision. "We need to evacuate, spread them across 3 locations. The main hospital in Kandahar, the clinic in the Green Zone, and the Norwegian base." His subordinate objected. "Sir, moving critical patients is risky." David heard his grandfather's voice in his head, words from old stories told at Passover dinners. "More risky than leaving them here to die from infection. We triage by severity, maintain care during transport, create spacing at each site, monitor continuously. That is the protocol." That protocol saved a lot of lives in a lot of wars. David smiled. "I know, my grandfather wrote it." The evacuations went smoothly. 3 medevac helicopters, patients distributed across the 3 sites. Mortality rate, 4%. If they had stayed concentrated in one overwhelmed facility, projections said 12%. The math still worked. 70 years later, the protocol still saved lives. That night, David called his father. Jake's son, also named David, now 70 years old himself. "Dad, I need to ask you something. Grandpa's story about Dachau, the evacuation, was that real?" "Every word." "Why?" "Because I just used his methods in Afghanistan, and they worked, exactly like he said they would." Silence on the line. Then his father's voice, thick with emotion. "He would be proud of you. I wish I had understood when he was alive. Wish I had told him I knew what he carried." He knew, son, he knew. 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic, hospitals overwhelmed, patients dying not from the virus but from overcrowding, from secondary infections spreading through packed wards, from lack of space and resources in air. Medical authorities around the world consulted NATO mass casualty protocols, established satellite facilities, convention centers converted to hospitals, patients distributed across multiple sites to prevent dangerous concentration. spacing emphasized over intensive centralization. The methods were 75 years old, developed in 8 desperate days by a young officer who refused to accept that 22,000 had to die. They still worked, still saved lives, still proved that sometimes the best medicine was space and clean air and the courage to break rules that were killing people. David Silverman, now a colonel, taught those protocols to young military doctors, always started the same way. These methods were developed in 1945 by my grandfather, Lieutenant Colonel Jacob Silverman. He saved 28,000 lives in 8 days. The military erased his name from the official reports. But every time we evacuate critical patients to save their lives, we honor him. Every time we create space for medicine to work, we carry his legacy. One student asked, why was his name erased? Because he was an infantry officer challenging medical experts. Because his methods contradicted doctrine. Because history prefers clean narratives over messy truths. But the truth is this: one man looked at impossible math, ignored everyone who said nothing could be done, and did it anyway. With help from a German prisoner named Hans Weber, who chose redemption over hate, who kept his promise for 60 years, who taught German students that humanity transcends nationality. David showed them Hans's drawings, preserved in a museum now, protected behind glass, but still powerful, still honest, still true. This is what courage looks like. Not dramatic, not heroic in the movie sense. Just a soldier doing what needs doing. A prisoner choosing to be better. And 28,000 lives continuing because 2 men refused to accept the unacceptable. Every helicopter that touches down in a combat zone carries their fingerprints. Every MASH unit that relocates overnight honors their memory. Every field hospital that spaces patients to prevent outbreaks uses their methods. Every refugee camp that creates satellite facilities, instead of one overcrowded death trap, follows their example. Every modern medical protocol that says move them, first treat them, second when environment kills faster than injury, all of it traces back to 8 days in April of 1945. When a 28-year-old Brooklyn infantry officer looked at dying people, ignored every expert who said nothing could be done, and did it anyway. When a 19-year-old German farm boy chose to help instead of hate, carried people he had been taught were not human, and learned what humanity truly means. Jake Silverman saved 28,000 lives the world tried to forget. Then the world forgot him. His name appears nowhere in the protocols, but his fingerprints are on every life those protocols save. Hans Weber kept his promise for 60 years, told the truth when silence was easier, taught redemption through action, proved that choosing better was always possible. 28,000 people saved, 200,000 descendants, now maybe more. Every birthday, every wedding, every child born to those families, Jake's invisible legacy, Hans's eternal witness. The Dachau Protocol was not just about medical evacuation. It was about refusing to accept that some people are beyond saving. It was about proving that the most American thing you can do is break every rule when rules mean death. It was about showing that kindness defeats hatred, that mercy outlasts cruelty, that humanity survives even hell. 2 enemies met in the worst place humanity ever created. They became brothers in the best work humanity could do. They proved that sometimes the most important thing one person can do is show another person a better way to be human. History forgot their names. But every time a doctor saves a life using methods they pioneered, Jake Silverman and Hans Weber are remembered. Invisible, unnamed, eternal. That is the legacy. Not the name on the protocol, not the medal or the recognition, but the lives continuing, the hearts beating, the impossible made possible, 28,000 times over, and still counting.